Thank you and welcome today. We're going to get started with a small poll and just Melanie's going to set it off.
The results should be displayed on the screen there. We have 41% who have been on a PCN board, 29% who have been on a non-PCN board, and 29% who answered, I've been board but have never been on a board.
A little governance humor. So we're just taking a quick poll to see where people's interests and experience has been, and we'll continue to move forward. So today we're going to talk about what is governance, why is it important, and why should I care? And when we talk about governance, it's a way, just in a big, there's many different definitions, but in essence, it's really about society and groups that organize to make good decisions, and decision-making and good governance must be legitimate and must be based on a solid strategic direction. There must be clear plans and expectations that allow the execution of those plans so that everyone is accountable to ensure that organizations' goals, objectives, and values are demonstrated and through consistent action, and it must perform effectively, be transparent, accountable, inclusive, and equitable. So there's many different board examples, and some of you have been part of a PCN board, so have an understanding of how that may work. Or some of you may have worked at a board or sort of sat on a condo board, for example, and have governed a condo scenario where you've had to be fiscally responsible for the members of that condo. So there's many examples of governance. So let's take a look. Corporate governance. Again, in this kind of a governance scenario, leaders set the organizational agenda for any organization, and they're accountable to ensure adherence at every level, from senior executives to the providers on the ground. And this is particularly vital in healthcare when we're talking about human lives. So there must be an absolute line of sight between decisions associated with fiscal responsibility, policy, and performance to every clinical setting where excellence is achieving patient safety, experience, and outcomes alongside provider experience, and both expected and enabled. So when we think about all those decisions, those are really important because they really set the tone and the structure of governance. But there's also clinical governance. So clinical governance is really a system for creating accountability to manage and to improve standards of clinical practice and identify the resources needed to deliver service to Albertans. So when good clinical governance exists, when clinical accountability is integrated with administration or sort of your business or organization in a continuous performance and quality improvement cycle. And the good clinical governance is to bring people together in a way that bridges all clinical activities and decisions in order to deliver high quality care, which I know many of you are part of. Well, let's talk a little bit about primary care networks. As an Albertan family physician, you're likely share a goal with hundreds of other family physicians across the province that through primary care networks, you can transform your healthcare system and create a sustainable system with outcomes that top any other jurisdiction in the world, with both satisfied patients and provider and care teams. So let's take a look at the timeline of how some of our governance events occurred across this timeline. So those way back in the day, one of our first PCNs formed was in 2005, and that was Edmonton Southside in Edmonton. And through that time, up until about 2014, we saw a whole proliferation of PCNs that we ended up with 42 by the end of 2014. We also, during the time of 2008 and 9, created PCN Leads Forum, a PCN forum that was created that started to bridge and bring physician groups across the province together. In 2010, AMA released the primary care vision paper. In 2011, the PCA was formed. In 2012, we had an unflattering auditor's general report come our way. And that did strike a lot of our work going forward in the last decade. Primary care strategies released in 2014. The Family College releases Patients Medical Home Vision for Canada. And in around 2015, we start to look at PCNs focused on medical home and panel. And by 2016, 42 PCNs were across the province, and sort of all the parts of Alberta were covered. In 2017, we introduced a new governance structure, which we'll talk about shortly. And a primary care integration network was established in 2017. And in 2020, the PPCNC new ministerial order was also established. And we'll talk about some of these a little bit further. In 2019, the PCN Physician Leads Executive paused to reflect on the question, why do PCNs exist? Well, we believe PCNs collectively advance the transformation of primary care by improving patient care delivery and health outcomes because, well, we support members and clinics, so many of you are part of different PCNs, and to implement Patients Medical Home are the platform to support change for new initiatives and direction, provide interdisciplinary team-based care programs, and strive to have a direct connection to member physicians. So what are PCNs funded to do? So part of the big question, well, not only do they lead primary care transformation, but they bring groups of physicians together with teams to deliver and coordinate clinical services to meet the unique primary needs of our community. And they act as a platform to implement and scale change by supporting physicians and teams to make changes in their clinic that advance them to fully optimize the patient's medical home. Well, you may be aware that there are 4 key PCN objectives, and one is accountable and effective governance is where we're going to focus our attention today. And that's really to establish a clear and effective governance role, structure, and process that supports shared accountability. So we do need to make and continue to make our governance structures effective and accountable. So let's take a look at how the structure of governance exists in Alberta. So when we take a look at the components of our structure, we'll begin with the Minister of Health and Deputy Minister of Health. And that has recently changed to Andrea Lagrange and Andre Tremblay. And really the mandate for Alberta Health is there to set the policy, the direction, and to sustain the accountable health system and to promote and protect the health of Albertans. And they're also responsible for funding healthcare in Alberta, including primary care networks. They also help define the vision and intended outcomes through some of the ministerial orders. So it is a bi-directional approach. And if we take a look at the provincial committee, the provincial PCN committee, known as PPCNC, the group is responsible for determining high-level strategic direction for primary care in the province. And they set specific goals, objectives, and targets, as well as endorsing large provincial initiatives for primary care and primary care networks. So that primary care network committee, terms of reference, is the ability for the deputy minister to approve a priority list of different objectives. Basically, and that PPNC is responsible for that oversight for a 2-year priority list that's created. And so when we look a little bit further in the green boxes, that is what we call our zone PCN committees. There is 5. And under that group, we have multiple PCNs that are all part of that particular zone. So part of the provincial PCN committee, we have 2 key committees that are struck. One is Measurement Evaluation Committee, and one is an Interzone Implementation Coordination Committee, which we've just initiated a PIN, which is the H2H provincial network. So when we talk about the provincial committee, We have representation from our physician representatives, PLEs. We have community members. We have Alberta Health. We have the Federation of Regulated Health Professionals, and we have Alberta Health Services that are all part of that committee, and they all have a role in pulling together the objectives. Well, the PCNs are elected. The physician lead execs are elected in their zones, and they're responsible to represent PCNs at a provincial leadership table. And if you want to know what's going on in your zone in terms of PCN priorities and goals, these are some of the key individuals that have that provincial and zone look. And so these are key individuals, and some are in transition like Calgary and North. So we have Joanne Robinson, Helen, Jordan, Heather, and Susan Byers. So each zone selects 2 representatives of their zone leadership. And then basically what happens is that PCN lead exec and Alberta Health Services are representatives on the zone PCN committee. Alberta Health Services representatives, they're appointed by their AHS leadership, but the PCN physician leader representatives are elected by each zone. So it's important to note that each PCN retains its own governance and aligns priorities to the zone PCN service plan. And it's also important to note that the bidirectional information flow, that each PCN continues with its own business plan and initiatives, but in addition, each PCN is also able to take their issues to the zone PCN committee, and the zone PCN committees can take those initiatives and communicate it to each PCN. So those 5 PCN zone committees are required subcommittees of the PPCNC committee, and their membership includes representation from PCNs, Alberta Health Services, and really they're helping create the deliverables for the zone. That's also part of the bigger focus of the system. PCNs fund the committee work through collaborative business plan amendments, and currently all PCNs in zone agree to contribute to the development and implementation of the different service plans. So there's 5 key service plans, 1 in each zone. And each primary care network develops their own business plan that ties in with that service plan and then is funneled over to the PPCNC. So we have a broad look across the whole province. And it's one way to sort of help align some of the key projects. Well, let's take a closer look now into the PCNs and how specifically they're organized and run. We've talked about each of the zones and the representation at each of the PCNs. And every PCN has a board, a physician board. And that board oversees the strategy, the budget, the priorities. And there's a partner called AHS, that's your joint partner. And that physician board has the ability to hire an executive director. And that executive director, for example, would hire a practice facilitator or facilitators. But the physician board, in many instances, is also hiring a medical director. So you'll see both these days. And so that executive director is responsible for the operations. So they hire the practice facilitator. And many of you that are working right in the field in Champions, you're working together with the practice facilitator, and you're supporting the clinics, the PMH, the change management, the conversations at that level. So let's take a quick look at the legal models, because this is where governance becomes really interesting. So not only is it at the system level, the provincial level, zone level, but now at the PCN level, where you've got 2 different models across the system, but they both really function and support each of the primary care networks. So a physician not-for-profit corporation is a legal entity and is bound by the laws of Alberta that govern a corporation. So those rules and obligations for all physician MPCs are the same regardless of their size. And those not-for-profit corporations vary greatly across the province. So sometimes you might have 10 physicians, and in other PCNs, not-for-profit corporations, you'll have 400 members of physicians. So it's The reason this happens is the Alberta Companies Act requires that the physicians to have what's called Articles of Association. And those are the rules of how NPCs run. And they cover items of how members join or exit or set up their board of directors, and the number of board members, the term for the board members, meeting protocols, and much more. And so that's kind of your backbone to how you run sort of that governance part of your not-for-profit corporation board. All physicians must have board directors, so they're elected by the physician members. And basically, best practice suggests the board includes a minimum of 3 executive positions, but somewhere about 5 to 7 is sort of the norm. And there's a number of different positions within a board, including chairperson or president, board secretary, treasurer. And sometimes boards also include a vice chair. But the board is accountable to all physicians who make up the not-for-profit corporation and serve to represent all physicians to make decisions on their behalf. And that's an important function of a board. Of course, it's best when all the board members have a vision of what's best for the corporation and the PCN overall, and not just what's best for them. And when you look at the slide deck, you'll both find that there's representation also, which we call a joint governance committee. So in Legal Mun, you also have AHS, that's got governance partners, and they form a governance committee. And so you have 2 representatives from your board and 2 representatives from AHS. In the Legal Model 1, that's your governance committee. In Legal Model 2, it's just slightly different. You've got a not-for-profit corporation board that also serves, along with you have a joint board, which is representations of physicians and Alberta Health Services, and they themselves kind of govern and hire executive directors. And that's all sort of within what we call a joint venture agreement. So the grant funding is directly funded to the primary care network. So no funding, no primary care network. Of recent years, articles were changed in order to allow community board members who have a business sense, a governance sense, to participate in the boards for the PCNs. And so those boards, so articles were changed in order to allow external individuals to come and join the board. And that over time has sustained itself. It's important that you have different people that are sitting on the board with different strengths that help you govern an MPC board or boards in general. And really, the importance is to ensure adherence to policy, accountability on the PCN funds, strong fiscal risk management, and ED relationship. So the board has 1 or 2 employees, and that's what is important, that they're governing and making sure that they have strong strategic views and that the ED can incorporate those into the operations. Same thing with Legal Model 2. Again, those articles were refined, and you have community board members that sit on a number of boards, not all of them. Sometimes they're difficult to come by depending on where you live. But again, they're responsible, whether it's this legal model or Legal Model 1, they're responsible for hires, EDs or MDs. A board should be a collective voice. They represent the physician MPC members and the PCN NPC board in this scenario. Physicians, they have equal say in operations, both AHS and physician group, and decisions throughout consensus building approach. So that's the general differences. So they both have both governance models. They just reflect them slightly different. And finally, what's important is that not only do you have these legal models that are driven by articles, but you also want to make sure that when you have a governing board, that you have a board policy manual that also talks about the details and how to operate and have distinctive roles and responsibilities listed in there and a whole host of other items. So that's an important additional feature to making sure you're governing well. Let's have a quick look on different governance boards. So many of you have already been on boards, but many of you maybe haven't trekked into there yet. So there is a number of different boards. And we think about serving there. Sometimes it can also be a hybrid between the different type of board types. So it's not always just pure or clean. So an advisory board is a body that exists primarily to provide advice or counsel an organization. But they typically are advisory board members, and they don't typically have legal responsibilities and often are appointed. Operations, well, sometimes in scenarios, and we've had scenarios like this that have occurred within PCNs, that basically executive directors may have left or they're unable to fulfill that position for a while. And so sometimes the board has to step in and do the operations of that board. And then policy governance, basically what it means, policy and governance, it's referred to any board attempting to govern by setting policy. And then finally, this is probably most like the ones you've seen or been part of, is people are legally accountable for providing the leadership and oversight of an incorporated organization. The founding members usually make up the first board of directors, and the governing body is usually elected at the organization's annual AGM, which is typical for the PCNs. And the board's officers typically own a chair, president, treasurer, and secretary. So that's most like what we have seen within the PCNs. Well, one of the things that's really important about governance is your fiduciary responsibilities. And basically, when we talk about fiduciary duty, it's somebody who manages something on behalf of someone else. So when we're dealing with money or decisions, those are important things to take into account. And usually we think of loyalty, obedience, and care. And for loyalty, that's really where the needs of the organization versus your own. So when you come to when you have your business or when you come to a PCN and you're sitting on the board, you're really looking at the needs of the organization and not just your own individual needs. Also really important to declare conflicts of interest. Let's talk about obedience. Ask what would a reasonable person do in that circumstance? And would it come to the same conclusion? So taking decision in a responsible way, and then duty of care. Oops, sorry, I messed it up. And to follow the laws and the policies to make sure we're carrying out the mission of the organization. So that's obedience, and care is just decisions in a responsible way. So in this case, we are constantly, we have public funding, and PCN funds are publicly dollar intended to enhance our programs, our public health system. And so we just need to think about being good stewards in that circumstance. Let's take a look at the PCN board governance and how that board, on behalf of its members, and it's working about in alignment with the organizational values, the needs and aspirations. So when we think about what's good governance, think about it from a strategic direction, when we have clarity around that, engages and directs at senior management. So those are your executive director and your medical director, and ultimately monitoring the results on the progress of that strategic direction. So let's take a little look at what the difference is between governance versus operations. In the chat, you can play along. So who approves long-range goals? Is it a board or is it management? Board. Who prepares a budget and financial statement? Is it the board or management? Yeah, management. Who approves the budget and financial statement? You guys are way too good. Board. Conduct performance review of an executive or medical director. Board, good. Should have put in a cliffhanger there. Who directs the staff? Management, good. Feel like everyone's getting 100%. Oversee the evaluation of a program or programs. Yeah, that's a tricky one. So there would definitely be management, but the board is also needs to take a look at the evaluation of the programs of the PCN to see where there's gaps. So it can be both, but in this instance, we're talking more about the programs and the oversight here. Approve service delivery models. Board or management? Board, yeah, you guys got it. And finally, implement service delivery models. Awesome, management. Perfect. Good job, everybody. Thanks for playing along. So, question to you guys is, what's your board experience? So, have you observed clear lines between governance and operations? Has your board blurred the lines between governance and operations? And how did you or your board members manage it? What's your biggest learning from being on the board? Michelle, can we take a quick stab at one of these questions? Let's start off with, have you guys seen observed lines between governance, blurred lines between governance and operations?
Wayne is nodding. Maybe Wayne, do you want to come off mute and tell us a bit about that?
Well, what I've observed in South Calgary, you know, with maybe with new, because we have a legal model too, and I guess when we have when the NPC group of the physicians, you know, meets sometimes, and especially when we have new members of that group, they're just really gung ho and they want to fix everything. So, but they get sort of admired in the operation, so that I think they lose sight of the function of where they're going. And then, but when they transition to the board and become they're a little more experienced, but I find with the NPC group at times is that they're just so keen that they just want to fix everything, and you know, and we have to remind them on the operations side that, hey, maybe that's just an operations thing, but thank you for your input. So that's what we found, is that they sometimes blur it a little bit. And also, it's a lack of understanding the difference between legal model 1 and 2, because you know, you get onto the board NPC in legal model 2, you think you're going to be doing stuff, but it's actually just sort of, you know, advocating for your own docs, right, and commenting on things, which is fine, but you know, trying to fix things is not the way to go. So,
Thank you.
And Janet commented in the chat that sometimes the board gets too involved in staffing issues. Janet, did you want to comment on that?
Sure. You know, the board shouldn't be making decisions about who's hired for what position, and they can get bogged down with that sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. I see Brad has his hand up.
I just, and this is kind of historic, but in the early days of PCNs, Michelle, there was a lot of this, right? And some of it was, I think, that the, you know, physicians coming on to a board like this had no governance experience, and they didn't really know where that line was kind of drawn. And so there was a lot of this in the early days of PCNs where, you know, PCNs were, or the board members were directing staff, you know, directing operations, acting almost as a pseudo executive director, you know, in some ways. And so we've come a long way, I think, in that, because that created some problems, right? You know, when the board starts directing programs and staff, it just accentuates conflicts of interest or the needs of that individual or an individual clinic versus the entire membership. And so we've come a long way since that time. And, if you come into a board now where we have mandatory governance training and a different level of sophistication, you might not think it's that important, but it really is. Like, it created a lot of historic problems.
Great to know. Moving forward, and good thing we've come a long way since the Wild West days of the early PCNs.
Awesome examples of some of your board experience. And it, even if you have really good governance, things do get blurry at times because we do like to solution. But we're going to continue. But think about what your biggest learning, and maybe we'll ask you in just a short bit, or if you could put it in the chat, that would be great. One of your biggest learnings. So thank you for promoting.
Michelle, just jumping. I see Lindsay had her hand up. Is it something that is pertaining to this, or will it?
Yeah, I was just going to say, another time we've seen in Central Zone when boards become more operational is when executive directors positions go vacant, right? So especially in the smaller zones, smaller PCNs, there's not a lot of like central support for PCNs. And Brad, yes, I had to be an executive director within my first 6 months of being on the board. Also, Brad had to do that too in our PCN. So, and our PCN is not alone. There was quite a few in Central Zone who've been executive director-less for a period of time and relied on the board to execute operations.
Good example, Lindsay. It's true. That's the operations part. So let's take a look at your governance and your clinic. So we know that there's system, we know there's general governance at a committee, at a zone level, at a PCN level, but let's talk about your clinics and how that manifests.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. So a couple key things to think about from a clinic governance hygiene is when you think about your own governance in your own clinics, what do you have in place that you can make sure that, kind of like the article of association, what do you have? Do you have a practice agreement or some kind of agreement in place that helps you understand the decisions and how they're made and how much you owe? What are some of the ways that you're managing your HR approach within your clinic to make sure that there's clarity? Even picking your EMR is an important part of governance. Your budget, your risk, and some succession planning are just a couple key highlights within your own clinic or your physician clinics. So you could take a quick screenshot of your QR code, and it does take you into one of our websites, and it does have a number of different articles, documents that you might find helpful for some of your clinical work and just general knowledge. So moving on to our discussion panel this morning, we have the lovely and talented Andy Baines, Brad Baylor, Janet Craig, Joseph Majetikin, Lindsay Naninga. And so they're going to help answer some of these questions, and we ask you to put in your information in the chat and join us. So let's kick it off. How do you apply good governance practices in your clinic? So one question I have to the panel is, do you have a practice agreement or some type of agreement in your clinic? Joseph or Lindsay or both?
Sure, I'll speak to that a little bit. Our clinic does have a practice agreement. We'd had like informal agreements or discussion whenever we had position meetings, for many, many years. And then when we transitioned to blended cap, it became clear that we needed just a little bit more clarity around the agreement of how we practice together. So we did a day or two, couple days intensive facilitated work to come up with a practice agreement and formalize it. That practice agreement obviously has changed as we've had, new team members onboarded. We've had further discussions about things, and we're now in a position, we've had quite a few new physicians enter into our clinic since we came up with that original practice agreement. And so we're looking probably over the next year of updating it with facilitator as well. And it's just a good document for us to have of like, hey, this is how we practice, this is what we value. These are the things that are important to us. And then there's been ad hoc discussion sort of along the way of how we interact and work together.
Awesome. Thanks, Lindsay.
Yeah, yes, same for us, Lindsay. So I agree with you. I think some of those informal meetings or no collaboration actually we find them much stronger than the formal contract or agreement between physicians in our clinic, especially as staff change. Processes are changing with the pandemic and all that. So meeting regularly, as things change, really has really upheld what we agreed when we started, especially with new physicians joining us. So the other thing that has helped us in our clinic is having a mission statement that we review on a regular basis. So it really helps us it redirects us to what our mission, what our goal really is, and helps us to, if something is suggested, we are able to, it's a benchmark for us. So when we have our discussions, is that really necessary? Do we really need to do that? Does that align with our initial goal? So I think those informal meetings to revalidate our initial agreements has been more helpful than the initial, contracts signed.
Thank you for those examples, Lindsay and Joseph. Another question that we have is, how do you make governance and business decisions in your clinic? These are a hard question, Brad and Andy. Over to you guys.
I'll go first because I think Brad's answer will be better. Get mine out of the way here. While I'd say it's quite hodgepodge, we have a clinic owner who is kind of a business person, not in healthcare. And so he's really good at kind of business operations and, but fortunately very receptive to our concerns, when the team brings up things. And so we're very lucky in that regard, because I have definitely heard from colleagues at other clinics where they don't have that great relationship, where they can come up to their clinic owner and say, hey, this is an issue and we'd like to change this. And fortunately for us, when we do bring things up, it's addressed eventually, not always in a timely manner. But so when we were making decisions, rarely is it that something isn't discussed between us and ownership and management. We have good communication in meetings. There's obviously been some major issues along the road, and we've talked about it and worked things out. But yeah, generally I would say, because we don't have that physician ownership, sometimes the way things happen is like a problem is identified within the team, like within the doctors or our staff, and then we bring it up to them and say, we need help with this. This is what we think we need you to do in terms of hiring or changes or EMR changes, and then have a discussion and usually get some results that way. But no formal process. We used to have really consistent meetings like pre-pandemic, and I think like many clinics, things kind of fell a little bit apart, and now we're just building that back up again with regular meetings with management and staff so that we can get back into that good communication pattern again.
Thanks, Andy. That's awesome.
Yeah, our practice agreement outlines the board basically of that agreement, and it's that which is all the physicians, by the way, and it's that group that actually makes governance business decisions in the clinic. We meet monthly, and then within that, many of the docs have subsequent kind of operational roles as well, where they take leads in certain aspects of the clinic, whether it be, financial monitoring, human resource liaison work, EMR lead, and they have kind of responsibilities that kind of extend between those meetings. But the decision making is outlined in our practice agreement, and it is that board. One of the things that I think we're starting to experiment with, or we have to figure out, is when you bring on people that don't want to be involved in the governance of a clinic necessarily, and they don't want to be kind of owner associates. We have some language in our practice agreement around how to connect with those individuals and their responsibilities, but it's not clearly laid out. And so we have some work to do in our own agreement around how we bring people on that don't want to be involved in governance and business decision making.
Awesome, thanks.
So, Wayne also put an example of what they do in their clinic in the chat there.
Wayne, would you just like to share with the group?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can do that. Our group's been together since 1989. So we have a pretty vibrant family medicine group that we've successfully retired a number of physicians, meaning they worked their whole practice and we transitioned them out. We had a big retirement party and they're all happy. We're all happy. We've got a replacement. But one thing is we actually encourage everybody to be an owner. So we actually don't have this sort of two-tier owner and employee physician. So we found that to be, important that, each person has skin in the game and they're just more invested in the practice. So if you don't want to be an owner, maybe this model won't fit for you. And then we make our expense sharing very, very simple. It's really the number of hours you work over the total number of hours the clinic's open, and times that by the total number of hours or shifts, and that works out to the overhead. And then the way we actually recruit physicians has been primarily we're actually a teaching clinic as well. And a lot of our younger physicians just see the way we are very collegial in the way we work. And then we've been actually pretty good at recruiting docs who just think like us. And we've been pretty happy. So we got maybe in terms of age distribution, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. I won't tell you where 1/3 I'm in, but we got a pretty good range of ages, and everybody, anywhere who more veterans to people in first year practice within our group. So
awesome, thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
Some really good insight.
And I noticed just one more thing. Janet brings a really interesting perspective, because the situation she's in is seeing a number of clinics, and I just wanted to see if you would expand a little bit on your comment in the chat, Janet.
Well, I think it's province-wide, but in Edmonton, I know of 5 clinics that have closed because they couldn't recruit any new physicians that wanted to be owners. New physicians were willing to sign on and work on a percentage and not be involved in the running of the clinic, but that wasn't going to work with the other owners who were planning to retire. And Brad, I think, has run into that as well. So Wayne, I agree. It's ideal when everyone's an owner and everyone has skin in the game, but you may have to revisit that down the road.
Yeah, definitely some new challenges in how to manage the agreement or how people want to work, for sure. Maybe we want to just move to one of the things that you also want to think about is we talk a lot about the practice agreements and business decisions, because that's often formed through that agreement. But also you want to retain a lot of your staff as well. So thinking about what you have in place for good HR practices is also an important part of just managing your internal staff. But when it's clear, it's also helpful. we're going to move on to a bigger question that we're going to ask everybody. And you're welcome to come off mute, or you're welcome to add your information within the chat. So as a PMH champion, how would you influence your clinic or your peers to consider good governance? What are some of your ideas? Maybe it's within your own clinic, maybe it's a PCN, or maybe how do you influence somebody who might be struggling?
I think
Anyone?
starting small maybe. So I mean, within my own clinic, I still have my own work to do before I go and probably talk to other clinics about work they should do. And so I think it's a delicate situation too. You can't always bulldoze through and kind of talk to owners about what they should and shouldn't be doing. When if you're not in that ownership position, like some of the docs you were talking about, it is tough to bring things up or ask for things in such a way that is going to get where you need to be without damaging your relationship. And so I think how I would influence at the beginning is just starting by like building that relationship, asking for meetings, asking to be more involved, and offering support and in decision making, so that it's kind of like you're offering help rather than telling someone what to do. And I think coming from that perspective has been helpful for me, and made sure that our relationship is good still, even though oftentimes we are kind of asking, criticizing, the ownership to get things done, and there's a bit of push and pull all the time, and it's kind of become almost like a joke where when I email the owner, he's like, oh, well, what do you want now? But it's that's how things get done, and that's how things get better.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Great examples. Anyone else have an example or thoughts that they'd like to share?
I think just the personal examples are pretty important. So, I've got some fails as examples we could share where their governance wasn't strong. And, as a group, we end up embroiled in, personal legal disagreements between spouses who are separating because we don't have a strong governance agreement. And then, other examples where we had to make an extremely difficult decision of removing an associate, and having a good process in place, good agreement in place, and allows you to kind of do that. It would be much more difficult if you weren't supported by an agreement. So personal examples kind of go a long way.
Great. And you want to do these things. It's not, you're not doing them when things are really good and things are moving forward. You actually want to anticipate that things may not go well. And that's why you would have these, whether it's good, you want good governance in your clinics as well, because things at some point will get tough. And so great example, Brad. Michelle, I'm going to move us on. So just a couple questions for you guys to consider in the future is knowing what you know now, what can you influence at your clinic level? And how will your involvement change now, knowing what you know now? And will you approach change management approach with your various projects and support and influence at your clinic level? So just some questions to consider when you're out in the field talking to some of your colleagues. Next. And of course, we always have to bring it back to the patient's medical home. And of course, foundationally, governance is important to both clinics, PCNs, and our entire system. And just practicing that piece, putting in an agreement, helps to create that really sustainable and helps you sort of continue with that good governance. So a couple places, of course, learn at AMA, Governance Essentials. Many of you spoke about it. Face-to-face financial course being hosted in Edmonton zone at this point in time. Of course, Vital Clinics and the Institute of Corporate Directors also has a lot of great governance information. And I'm sure you guys also have your favorite spots. There's many places. These are just a few. These are our next training sessions. You can also find them on our website. And over to Michelle.
Yeah, and as always, we'll send links to all of these that I think that Michelle has mentioned in the summary email that will come out later, as well as the recording. And a reminder to claim your CME credits. I think you should all know how to do that at this point, but again, just on the AMA member dashboard. A wrap up, we are taking the summer off, so hope all of you have an excellent summer. Our next session will be on September 13th, and it will be on mastering the art of effective feedback. So back into our leads in a caring environment work. Yeah, and again, watch for the summary email, and thank you all and have a wonderful summer. And thank you, Michelle, for being a fabulous guest presenter today, and to our panel for providing your wisdom, and for everyone for attending today.